There is a stretch of the Ozarks where the county maps simply stop. Not a border, not a state line, just an empty patch of green where the paved roads trail off and the names run out. Locals called it Perished Creek, though you will not find that name printed on any modern survey. The family that lived up that hollow called themselves the Spates, and for the better part of a century, nobody with any sense walked up there after dark. There were stories about what the Spates kept curing in their smokehouse through the long summers. Stories about why the water ran cloudy every spring, and why even the deer refused to cross the ridge. For decades, the state insisted those stories were nothing but backwoods gossip, the kind of tall tale that grows in a place with no electricity and no real road. Then, in the summer of 1948, a survey crew climbed up Perished Creek to map the watershed for a proposed dam. 4 men went into that hollow. Only 2 came back down the trail, and neither of them would ever finish a sentence about what they found up there. To understand the Spates, you have to understand the ground they lived on, because the ground came first, and the ground was already wrong. Perished Creek sits in a fold of the hills that the earliest government surveyors marked as unmapped, and then quietly left blank. When the first settlers pushed into that part of the Ozarks in the 1830s, they found something they could not explain. Cut stone. Foundations set into the hillsides, squared and fitted, far older and far more careful than anything a frontier family could have raised by hand. Low walls ran along the creek in patterns that made no sense for farming and no sense for defense. The settlers who arrived assumed some earlier people had built it and moved on, and so they did what tired people always do. They built on top of it. They laid their cabins over those old foundations and used the ancient cut stone for their chimneys and their wells. The strangest detail, the one the early settlers argued about for years, was the line on the stone. Every one of those squared foundations carried a stain about waist high, a dark horizontal mark like a tide line, as if the whole hollow had once stood under still water long enough to leave a ring. Above the line the stone was clean. Below it the stone was packed with a fine grey silt that no creek in those hills could ever have laid down. It was the kind of thing that made an educated man uneasy and made a mountain family go quiet, because it meant the walls they were living inside had been buried once and dug back out again, and nobody living had done the digging. Every family that tried to settle that hollow left within a single season. Every family except one. The Spates arrived sometime around 1841, and the Spates never left. They took the largest of the old stone foundations for their homestead, the one set deepest into the hill where the creek came up cold out of the bare rock, and they built a house there that grew, room by crooked room, for the next 100 years. Nobody knew exactly where the Spates had come from, and that was the first thing that unsettled the surrounding hollows. They had no church, no county paper, no record of arrival anywhere. They paid for nothing in cash. When they came down to the trading post at the mouth of the valley, which happened maybe twice a year, they came as a group, and they came silent. And they traded cured meat and strange soft candles for salt, powder, and iron. The meat was always good. The candles were the problem. They burned far too long, and they smelled faintly of something no one at the post could ever name, and more than one trader admitted, years later, that they had stopped lighting the Speight candles and started burying them out back behind the store. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the Speight family history, the state quietly deleted, the 17 names struck from the county rolls, the exact patch of the map they left blank on purpose, the sheriff's own report, word for word, on what was hanging in the smokehouse. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The Spates did not send their children down to the valley school. They did not marry into any of the other families. The old people in the neighbouring hollows said the Spates only ever married their own, generation after generation, up in that closed fold of hills, and you could see it in them by the 3rd or 4th decade. Something in the faces, something in the way they all moved the same, tilted their heads the same, watched you the same. A peddler named Alton, who worked that route in the 1880s, wrote in his ledger that he had stopped going up Perished Creek entirely. He wrote that the whole family would come out onto the porch to watch him climb the trail. All of them, the old and the young and the ones he could not put an age to, and that not one of them ever waved, and not one of them ever spoke, and that the children never played and never once cried. There was one more line in the ledger before he changed his route for good. On that final trip up the hollow, Alton had counted the graves behind the house, and by his own tally there were far more graves back there than there had ever been living Spates. In 1894, a young schoolteacher from the valley decided the Speight children at least deserved a chance at their letters, and she walked up the hollow one Sunday with a slate and a bag of primers. She came back down the same afternoon, white as the slate she carried, and she never taught in that county again. All anyone could ever get out of her was that the children could already read, that they had shown her a book, and that the book was written in no language she knew, and that when she asked one of them where it had come from, the oldest boy had simply pointed down. Not down the trail. Down. The hollows around Perished Creek learned to judge the deep of winter by the sound of it. In the hard cold of January, when the wind fell still and the snow killed every other noise for miles, people 2 ridges away swore you could hear singing come drifting down off that hill. It was not hymns, and it was not any tune that carried words. It was a low, even sound, many voices holding one single note far longer than a breath should ever last, and it always came in the dead middle of the night, and it always stopped at once, as if someone up there had given a signal. Parents in the valley told their children the singing was only the wind moving through the old rocks. The parents did not much believe it either. The first person to ever put the Spates into an official record was a census taker named Harmon Wells, who went up Perished Creek in the spring of 1911. He was the only government man to make that climb, spend the whole day, and write it all down. His pages still survive in the county archive, and they are not like any other census pages from that year. Most households in the county took a line or two of his careful hand. The Speight household took 3 full sheets, and Harmon Wells never finished them. He listed a patriarch he estimated at 90 years old, and then a second man he also put near 90 who the family insisted was the first man's son. Alongside them were 17 individuals, sharing only 4 given names among all of them. He listed children whose ages did not match their sizes, and grown adults the family could not, or would not, name for him. Halfway down the second sheet, his neat clerk's handwriting begins to come apart. The letters grow larger, the lines start to slope, and near the bottom of the third sheet, below a row he left completely blank, he wrote a single note that had nothing to do with counting people at all. He wrote that the family had shown him what they kept in the root cellar, and that he was leaving now, and that the county should never send another living soul up that hollow again. Harmon Wells walked back down that evening, turned in his unfinished pages, and resigned his position inside of a week. 2 months later, the county did something it had no legal authority to do. It struck the entire Speight household from the rolls. 17 names, wiped out with a single stroke of ink, marked in the margin as an area unfit for enumeration. Perished Creek was quietly reclassified as unincorporated and unsurveyed, which is a bureaucratic way of saying the county chose, on purpose, to pretend it was not there. For the next 37 years, officially, on every record that mattered, nobody at all lived up that hollow. The men who made that decision left almost nothing behind explaining why, and that silence is its own kind of answer. County commissioners of that era wrote down everything. They argued in the minutes about the price of gravel and the width of a footbridge. But on the matter of striking 17 living people from the record and pretending a whole hollow did not exist, the minutes hold exactly 1 sentence, entered by a clerk and initialed by 3 separate commissioners. It reads that the situation at Perished Creek had been reviewed and that no further action would be taken by this body, ever. The word ever is underlined twice. Grown men who had spent whole careers being careful with their words chose to underline a single word twice and then never speak of the matter again. Before we move on to what the survey crew found in 1948, stop for a second. What you just heard about the census the county erased is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original county pages. The 17 names. The blank row. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. For 37 years the hollow kept to itself, and the wider world very nearly forgot it existed at all. Then the state decided to build a dam. The plan called for flooding a long valley 2 ridges over, and Perished Creek fed into that same watershed, so a survey crew was assigned to go up and map it. 4 men drew the job. Their foreman kept a field log, and that log is the only reason we know anything at all about the last days of the Speight family. The crew reached the mouth of the hollow on a Tuesday and made their camp. Their foreman noted that the old stone walls along the creek were unlike any stonework he had ever seen in the state, and that his compass would not settle anywhere near the ridge. The field log tells the story in the gap between what the foreman wrote and what he suddenly stopped writing. The early pages are dense with the ordinary work of surveying, elevations and bearings and notes on the timber. Then, the closer the crew climbs toward the homestead, the shorter each entry becomes, until a professional man who had filled half a notebook in 2 days is abruptly writing 3 words to a page. On the Wednesday, they went up toward the house. He wrote that it was still standing and still lived in, that smoke rose from the chimney, and that they were met on the trail by a group of Spates who did not speak and did not block the way, but simply turned and walked ahead of the crew toward the house, as though the men had been expected for some time. That is the last full entry in the log. The next page holds only a date and 3 words, pressed so hard the pencil tore clean through the paper. Root cellar, smokehouse, leave. After that, the handwriting stops entirely. We know the rest from the sheriff. 2 of the 4 men came stumbling out of the hollow near midnight, and one of them had walked the entire way down without his boots. The sheriff rode up the following morning with 3 deputies. His report is brief, and it is the single most careful document in the entire county file, because a man who has seen something terrible chooses his words like they cost him money. According to that report, the house stood empty. The family was gone, all 17 of them, with the cook fire still warm and food still set out on the table. He opened the smokehouse, closed it again at once, and posted a deputy at the door with orders to let no living person inside. What was hanging in there, he wrote in the plainest words he could find, was not deer and it was not hog, and the 2 missing survey men were never found. Not that spring, and not in any spring after, though the search dragged on for a full month. The deputy who drew the night watch at the smokehouse door lasted only until just before dawn. His relief found him sitting a good 40 yards off in the wet grass, his lantern long gone out, staring back up at the dark ridge, and he would only say that he had heard something moving on the far side of that door, and that a thing shut up dead in a smokehouse has no business moving at all. By the time the sheriff came back up with orders to nail the door shut for good, the smokehouse stood empty. Whatever had been hanging inside it the night before was simply no longer there, and the deputy swore on his life that nothing living had passed him in the dark. The 2 men who did walk out were never the same again, and the county doctor who examined them wrote that neither one had a single mark on his body. Whatever had emptied them out had left the flesh untouched. One of them, the one who had come down without his boots, lived another 40 years in a locked room at the state hospital and spoke maybe a dozen words the whole time. When he did speak, it was always the same request, repeated to any nurse who would stop and listen. He asked them to please make sure the cellar door was shut. Which cellar it was, no one ever told him, and he never once said he only wanted it shut. Here is where the story stops being a ghost tale and becomes something far colder, because the moment the full county file was finally opened, the pattern was impossible to miss. For over 100 years, people had been going missing along the roads that fed into Perished Creek. Peddlers, timbermen, a pair of travelling circuit preachers in 1877, a whole family in a covered wagon in 1902 who were seen at the trading post at the mouth of the valley and then simply never seen at the town on the far side. Each disappearance had been written up on its own, filed away in its own year, and blamed on the river or the winter or the general wildness of the country. Nobody had ever thought to set them all down side by side. When an investigator finally laid the county's missing person files across one table, year against year, the number stopped him cold. Over the better part of a century, more than 60 travellers had walked into the country around Perished Creek and simply ended there. 60 people, filed one at a time, so that no single clerk had ever once seen the shape of the whole thing. The candles went off to a state chemist in the capital, a man well used to identifying poisons and adulterated food, the sort of expert who is hard to unsettle. His letter back to the county runs only 2 short paragraphs. The first is technical, and it refuses, in very careful language, to name the fat that the candles had been rendered from. The second paragraph is not technical at all. It asks plainly whether the remaining samples might be destroyed, and whether he might be told nothing further about where they had come from. A chemist who spent his life pulling secrets out of jars asked to be kept in the dark. That single request tells you almost everything about what those candles truly were. And the soft cured meat the family had always carried down to trade, the meat that everyone agreed was always so very good, no longer needed any explaining at all. And the graves behind the house, the ones the peddler Alton had counted and found far too many of, were finally understood for what they had always been. They were not the place where the Spates buried their own dead. They were the place where the Spates buried whatever was left of everyone else. There is one last piece, and it is the piece that keeps this from being merely a crime. The oldest settlers had always insisted the Spates did not invent what they did up in that hollow, they inherited it. Those squared stone foundations, the low walls running along the creek in patterns no farmer would ever build, the reason the water came up cold and cloudy straight out of the rock, the dark tide line ringing every wall. The Spates had found all of it already waiting for them when they arrived, and something in them, or something down in that buried ground, had told them plainly what it was all for. For generations the family kept a practice going that was older than the county, older than the state, older than any name we still have for the people who first squared that stone and then vanished under the silt. The Spates were not the beginning of the horror at Perished Creek. They were only its last, and its longest, caretakers. The dam was never built where they had planned it. The survey was abandoned outright, the watershed rerouted, and every page of paperwork for Perished Creek was pulled from the active files and placed somewhere it would never again be asked about. Its name came off the maps for good. If you drive the Ozark backroads today and go hunting for Perished Creek, you will not find a single sign for it, and you will not find it on your phone either, because it was scrubbed on purpose by people who decided the safest thing in the world was to make it disappear from memory the same way it had disappeared from the census. The house itself is gone now. It burned at some point in the 50s, and no one ever recorded who lit the match. But the foundations are still up there, that old squared stone the Spates never built and never truly understood, set deep into the hill where the creek still comes up cold and still runs its dark ring around the base of every wall. Hunters who wander too far up that fold of the hills tend to come back early, and they cannot always tell you exactly why. They talk about a stillness. They talk about a tree line where the birds all go quiet and the deer will not cross, standing on precisely the spot where an old peddler once counted too many graves in the dark. Every few years someone still goes looking for it anyway. A hiker with an old map, a local historian who caught the name once from a grandparent. Each one sets out full of questions, and then, more often than not, they go strangely quiet on the subject afterward, and when you ask them straight what they found up there, they give you some version of the very same answer. They found the foundations. They found the tree line where the birds stopped singing, and they found, very quickly, that they did not want to stay long enough to find anything else. Whatever the Spates were keeping up in that hollow, the family is gone now. The hollow is not, and the creek, cloudy every spring, still runs down out of that cold black rock and into the water that thousands of people drink today without ever once stopping to ask exactly where it comes from.